It's a pleasure to be here and have an opportunity to talk about where we are with climate change from the climate science point of view. Let me introduce myself very briefly. I've been a climate scientist for a long time. I've been involved with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment, and I've been involved with scenario analysis for a very long time. The perspective in climate science is changing from a focus on trying to demonstrate that climate change is real to trying to understand how climate change will play out in the world that we live in, and trying to understand what the consequences and impacts of that climate change will be. And I'd like to focus on two aspects of our scientific understanding. First, although climate models have been reasonably reliable in predicting the overall trajectory of global warming, that is mean annual temperature, as an indicator of the effects of greenhouse gases, I think it's become apparent to everybody that the impacts of climate change are being manifest in many ways through the extremes of the climate system, through severe weather, cyclonic storms, hurricanes, and cyclones, events that were frequently, that were previously quite rare, like derecho winds, and sea level events. Now, for many years, the received wisdom from climate impact scientists really focused on the notion of a gradual warming of the Earth, rapid relative to historic warming. But the assumption was that it would occur in an orderly enough way that market forces would allow optimal and relatively low-cost adaptation to climate impacts. And much of the concern was around equity rather than the consequences for the global economy. But as things have played out, that view is changing very rapidly. And many of the types of climate events that we're seeing now, and we'll see with increasing frequency and severity until we stabilize greenhouse gases, and perhaps even for some time after that, are very difficult or very expensive to adapt to. Wildfire, drought, impacts on irrigation, sea level events like Superstorm Sandy. These are very difficult physical risks to adapt to. And we see this playing out in the business sector and in finance. The recent rather dramatic changes to insurance in the state of California are, I think, an indicator of the types of consequences for the financial system that we're going to increasingly be seeing. So climate change doesn't occur in a smooth and somewhat predictable way that we can adapt to in an orderly manner. In fact, it occurs in a very hard to predict and very expensive to respond to mode. And there'll be, I think, continuing surprises with events that are very impactful for human health, well-being, property, and infrastructure. At the same time, economic projections of the cost of mitigation, the transition away from fossil fuels, have in general been overestimated. As one example, the costs of solar have gone down 4 to 10 times more rapidly than anticipated in early assessment studies. And the costs of many of the technologies that revolve around electrification have also decreased very rapidly, with attendant increases in efficiency, scale, and so on. So the challenges that we face are in one sense worse than we'd expected because of the manifestation of climate change in very hard to adapt to or very expensive to adapt to risks. But in another sense, they're easier. Innovation, investment, and changes to infrastructure are occurring rapidly and at lower cost than many had feared earlier. As a result of all this taken together, climate change, physical risk, and transition risk are part of the landscape of business, as Nels has laid out. But they're also an opportunity for investment, innovation, and profit. And in fact, because if you will, the net impact of climate change on the economy is the difference between avoided impacts, the cost of mitigation, and the cost of damages, because the cost of mitigation is lower than we had anticipated and the impact of damages greater than we had anticipated. There are many economic opportunities for the business sector to efficiently and profitably respond to the challenges of avoiding physical risk, coping with physical risk, and dealing with transition risk. And this is really the perspective from the science, that on the one hand, we now really understand that the regulations that are in place, the changes to the environment, to the business environment, are important and needed. But on the other hand, the costs of action are really well within our grasp if we can motivate investment in an efficient way and provide the relevant signals, market signals, to allow for an efficient and orderly transition.